With me, I've got Emma Hilton, who is one of Sex Matters board members and an advisor to us specifically on the issues that arise in sport when it comes to sex-based rights. And I think most people who know anything about sports in this issue know Ross Tucker's name as well. And if you don't, he tweets and podcasts and so on as the science of sport. And he's really an eminent sports scientist, but specifically an expert in rugby. And he is the reason why World Rugby is by far the sanest of the global regulators on the subject of sport. So what we're going to do is spend about 40 minutes talking between myself, Emma and Ross, obviously them talking and me just facilitating. And then we're going to have what I'm thinking of as a little 2-minute commercial break to tell you a bit about what Sex Matters does. And then the rest of the hour will be dedicated to questions from you. I'm not going to be unmuting people, so you can put your questions into the Q&A, and our elf behind the scenes, Sarah, is going to collate questions and have them ready for me. So why don't we just start, actually? And Emma, I queued you up for this, so I don't feel guilty that it's a tough one. Can you give me like a potted history of trans women in women's sports in like, say, 3 minutes?
So the first thing we ever had from the IOC was back in 2003, the International Olympic Committee. They've been wrestling, you know, people around these kind of international level regulators have been wrestling with this you know, way back from the 80s or 90s, since we stopped kind of sex verification tests and that kind of thing. So the question of whether, you know, males should be in female sports, the IOC first actually laid down some guidelines in 2003. And what they said at this point was they already knew, it's evident from their explanatory notes, they already had considered the idea that males would carry advantage through from puberty, but that they probably weren't going to have to deal with a huge number of cases, right? So at this point, we're thinking about, you know, it's back in 2003, Renee Richards, those kind of older males who are, you know, not really going to challenge, you know, a 100-meter sprint at the Olympics. So case by case, let's think about what we have to deal with when we're faced with it. So it's a bit of a scramble. And in 2003, what they said was, you know, you need to have had surgery, you need to have had your hormone levels in line with females for at least 2 years, and you need to have like a legal status as female in your own country. And so that worked. Well, I mean, I say it worked, that was the guideline. And then in 2015, they updated their guidelines. They decided that, you know, requiring surgery was a human rights kind of issue, that you couldn't ask males who wanted to transition to have surgery. So testosterone suppression became the gold standard. No need for legal status in your home country, because not all countries recognise gender transition. So just a sworn declaration then, and that would be sufficient to create, well, we infer to create parity. They used, well, they tried to map some studies along the way. I guess we're going to talk about some of those studies along the way. But they seem to have, even 30 years ago, taken a very inclusive view. They went straight for, you know, we don't think it's going to be a big problem. Now, we know that increasingly in the world that we live in, there are now more and more people who are identifying into different sex categories, who are wishing to compete in a different sex category. And that's now why we are here. This is trying to understand, I think, how those rules have come about, and the lack of scientific evidence that you know, underpins them.
So for those who joined us late, welcome to the very first ever Sex Matters webinar, which is on the fascinating and very topical issue of trans women in women's sports. And with me, I've got Emma Hilton, who is a developmental biologist and who is one of the Sex Matters board members, and Ross Tucker, an eminent sports scientist who in particular has been instrumental in getting World Rugby to think about this issue seriously. So Ross, when did you get your head around the idea that this was maybe something that couldn't be accommodated? I know that it kind of slid through like in your peripheral vision at first, and then at some point you looked at it directly.
Fair about it. It didn't just slip into my peripheral vision. It crossed right in front of my eye line and then went off to the other side. In 2009, I was involved in a biological sex in sport debate, because that was when Caster Semenya became a big story in the world of sport. And so back then the question was, should she, this is not a trans woman issue, this is an athlete with a difference of sex development, but conceptually the same thing, it's male advantage in women's sport, should she be allowed to compete? And the framing of that discussion was never, does the removal of testosterone create parity? It was whether it was ethical to ask someone to lower it. So it was almost assumed, which was interesting looking back. And certainly I'm guilty of assuming the same thing, because it was just by that stage, by 2009, it feels as though the sports had been captured enough that they weren't really even asking that question. They'd proceeded as though it was a fait accompli, that lowering the testosterone was all it would take. But then what happened was I started working for World Rugby in 2015, and by 2017, rugby had become an Olympic sport. Well, it had before. Rio was our Olympic debut. And the chief medical officer at the time knew that I'd had this involvement with the Semenya story. And he said, look, this sounds like it's in your wheelhouse. I'm going to forward you all the emails from the IOC where they were discussing what Emma just alluded to. And that was whether they were going to update their transgender guidelines. Now, in hindsight, we know that they never did. There was a draft document which was eventually leaked to the press, but that document never made it out. And it didn't make it out because there was a dispute among the scientists in the IOC's working group on this issue. And I was sent all those emails, and it was one of a few different eye-opening experiences, because I read this chain of emails, and it was all the characters that Emma would know, and maybe you and many listeners. It was Harper, Eric Verlaine, Stefan Bermon, who was the chief medical guy at World Athletics, Richard Budgett was there from the International Olympic Committee, Hirschberg, and so on. And the most striking thing is that they were in a dispute about whether the testosterone level should be 10 or 5. That was it. And they were divided. They couldn't agree on whether that target should be 10 or 5. And the most interesting thing is, nowhere in this entire discussion did anyone stop to ask whether there was evidence that 5 achieved a different performance compared to 10. And I remember thinking, the absence of that debate was quite telling. And then at exactly the same time, scientist by the name of Tommy Lundberg, who ended up writing that, I think, watershed review that was published by Emma and Tommy, he emailed me and he said, listen, I've got some data on this, and I thought it would be of interest to you. And do I have any suggestions to him about how he can get this out there? Which was another incredible thing, because these researchers at Stockholm had done this work, and they'd not yet published it, but it was out there. People knew it. And not a single sports federation had thought to ask them what it might mean. And then all this eventually converged on the fact that World Rugby said, maybe we need to think about our policy. Because
tell us a bit about why World Rugby was the sport. I mean, I think, honestly, because you and I've talked about it, that part of the answer is you're the answer. But also, rugby itself has some extra issues perhaps to consider compared with, say, running.
It does. And I mean, I don't think I'm the answer. That's flattering. But I think the difference is that the people above me who were open to listen, because it's not as though the other sports federations aren't aware of what I'm saying and what Emma's saying and Tommy's saying. They know, but the difference was World Rugby was prepared to listen. That wasn't me, that was them upstairs. But the reason it happened was because the sport states at every opportunity it gets that player welfare is the #1 priority. And I know a lot of people will criticize that and say anyone can say anything, talk is cheap. But I'm biased, I know that, but I think it's genuine and they are really sincere. And so when the discussion comes about to say, actually, there's this emerging problem where male physiology, which we know creates speed, power, strength, bulk, height, advantages, disparities, might be entering the women's game, which is also a priority area for rugby. There are 6 pillars in our player welfare plan and World Rugby plan, and women's rugby is one of those. Then everyone's listening, because so much alignment. So we were getting complaints from referees in the UK who were saying that they felt uncomfortable when they would arrive at a match and there was a trans woman playing against girls and women, saying, we don't want to referee this game because we know we're potentially liable. And so there were 3 or 4 different things happened at the same time. And I went and said, listen, I think we need to do this from scratch. And they were open and receptive. And that's how it came about.
Emma, your origin story, I guess, was the Fond of Beatles Twitter account, which you set up before you were willing to speak openly on this. And I think you came out at that big event at the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre. That was maybe the first time your name was put to that Twitter handle, was it? When did you notice that this is an issue personally, and how did you decide to start talking about it and then to put your name to the handle?
So I think I've always said, and it's not a novel kind of concept for people who've heard me talk about this before, I'm a feminist, I'm a developmental biologist, and I'm someone who really likes sports. And there's a Venn diagram, and the middle of that is when you are watching, sports that you kind of like to watch, and you see a trans woman playing, okay, whether it's in an MMA ring or on a rugby pitch or, in weightlifting, for example. And so you see that. And I think the first time the sports thing came on my radar was an MMA fighter called Fallon Fox, who is a trans woman who had transitioned well into adulthood and had been, still is, I guess, a US Navy veteran, right? So immediately I'm thinking, well, I know sports, I know developmental biology, and there's a bit of my kind of politics that's going, is that fair? And at this point, was back in 2014. At this point, the IOC had happily said, this person can compete. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it is fair. Maybe someone else has, kind of analysed the data. Maybe there's been some big process. And really, I thought, I'm just going to go, scientists are really tenacious. I'm just going to go and have a look. Let's go and look for them, the minutes of their meeting. Let's go and look for their references. Let's go and see what they've studied. And so in 2014, it was the 2003 meeting, which I think was fairly ad hoc and didn't really contain, a huge amount of scientific kind of background. And I'm thinking, what did they have then? Why did they make these kinds of decisions? And then later and later, we're seeing, increasing numbers of trans women who want to play in female sports. And how is this kind of, where are they pitching themselves here? Because I'm increasingly thinking, I don't think it's fair. And then thinking, I'm a developmental biologist, I can do this. I've got a different angle. There's a lot of sports scientists and they look at, numbers and finish times and that. And I'm thinking, I know what male puberty is. I know what that does. I know what these hormones are for, what they create, how they build different types of bodies. And has anyone ever really gone for that kind of, building up from the foundations? And that's where I kind of found, I guess, the philosophy angle, which is building from kind of first principles and thinking, why do categories even exist? Because once you bring it back to why categories exist in the first place, it becomes, for me, quite a simple argument. It's not about, how do people finish? How fast do they run? How much weight can they lift? It becomes about, why do we have male and female categories in the first place? And what changes? How can those thresholds be crossed? Can that happen without undermining the category itself?
Ross, I think when you and I first talked, which was a few years ago, I think it was when I was thinking of writing my book first, you thought that the way that was conceptualized was something like, there is male advantage, that's obvious, we know it, that's why there are categories, but it might be possible to reduce that male advantage by hormone suppression. And that was the model that was in their mind, that you could do that. Am I right there? Does that strike you as the right way to think about what they thought they were doing?
Yeah, I think that's definitely what they thought. I mean, everyone knows that the okay, not everyone. There are some people in this debate who've denied even this reality. But the fact is that males have advantages in sport by virtue of what testosterone causes during development. Everyone recognized that. And I think their thinking was, if testosterone is the source of the problem, then if we take away the source, we can treat the problem at that point, and we can get rid of this, and we can save the day. I'm sure that they had, I know these sports, we've been involved so often, they've got delusions that they can come in, I think, and save the day. And I reckon they thought that they'd sail in there and fix a societal problem and a sporting problem all in one go. And the answer was going to be testosterone. And they were persuaded of that because their very first voice, I think they heard, was that of Joanna Harper, who had surveyed, and I use the word advisor.
Tell us a bit about who Joanna Harper is.
So Joanna Harper is a trans woman who's currently, she's Canadian, was living in Portland, and is now in Loughborough in the UK, where she's doing a PhD on this very issue. Before, I think, was a medical physicist and worked in Portland, and had been a fairly good athlete, male athlete, then transitioned, suppressed testosterone for whatever was required at the time, and argued that she moved from ranking X among men into ranking X among women. In other words, perfectly laterally. So, and she then surveyed a number of other athletes who'd done the same thing, all endurance runners. And there was major methodological issues with that study, but it was the only one that the IOC ever really considered. There were others, not many. There've been many, many more in the last few years, but at the time it was one of the few. And she gave the IOC the opportunity to say, we can fix this and keep everyone happy at the same time.
So they were looking for a magic.
Yeah, they were looking for Solomonic wisdom. They were looking to cut the baby in half and keep everyone happy at the same time. And I don't know what the mood was in that discussion at the time, but I'm sure that they must have felt some pressure to try and accommodate trans women in women's sport. That, and again, there've been a few comments I've seen in the chat and so on about were there any women involved. The answer is no, there weren't. So that might tell you why there wasn't consideration of certain other arguments. But I think they left it the opportunity. For them, it was a life jacket, and they took it. And to this day, there are people who can't let go of that because they're too invested in it being the solution.
Well, it's very hard to take things back from somebody once you've given them. So I can see that from their point of view, they're going to get legal challenges, aren't they, if they try to row back?
Yes, I would imagine so. Especially now. I don't know I wouldn't know what it was like 17, 18 years ago, but they must have had some fear about that. I'm sure that there were some of them, not to defend them, who were trying to do what they thought was the decent thing, and they were maybe misled and they didn't consider the evidence the way they should have. So in a sense, they betrayed their scientific integrity to do it, but out of what in their minds was decency. Yeah, and then that's where we are. Then obviously there are other motives that are in play now. I think now it's become corrupted a little bit by pressures that are far larger than they would have faced at that point.
So let's hold off for another few minutes about talking about the current scenario. And Emma, I'd like to take you back to that Queen Elizabeth II event, which I think was, in the UK at least, quite pivotal for us. So that was a Woman's Place UK event, and it was an in-person event before the pandemic started. And Sharon Davies came, and this enormous conference hall was filled. And I wasn't there because it was on a Wednesday and I was editing a section of The Economist. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so it was Women's Place UK and Fair Play for Women together. And I think it was, there'd been kind of events talking about aspects of a particular, the gender recognition reform that was going through at the time. But this was really a major kind of coming together of two key, coalitions. And walking into that room, I think that was the first time I'd spoken in public. I think I had, what's the word? De-anonymized. I'd
you would come out
on Twitter before, which obviously then people could Google me, and my university, I think, got an awful lot of complaints straight off. But it was the first time I'd ever really spoken, and in a formal, I guess, academic sense. I knew where I was going. I knew that in a couple of years this would be a paper, that kind of thing. But standing there and looking at, you know, there was I think there were like 1,000 women. I don't know, I could be making that up, but it looked like 1,000. and you're talking and you realise that sport, you know, it's not that surprising. Sport brings a lot of people together because, you know, most of us are fairly kind of interested in sport. But being around women that were really supportive of what I was doing, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, you know, I think it was a watershed moment. I think it was a time where, you know, when you're at an event and they say, we're going to take a photo, if you don't want to be photographed. And there were really many women who weren't being photographed, and men in the audience, you know, men quite like sport.
Daley Thompson was there, wasn't he?
Yeah, Daley Thompson. I saw him in the green room and I think I nearly fainted. But yeah, I think it was really important, and I think we do, you know, Sex Matters is kind of moving forward with this, but Nick Williams, Fiona at Fair Play for Women have been absolutely instrumental in really getting this out into the public consciousness. So I'd like to say
shout out to them. And Judith, I can see, is in the chat, and she says it's 750 people were there and it was a sellout. Okay. Ross, so tell me, when you decided that you needed to do something that was solid and sound at World Rugby, you had already been involved in a process to discuss Castra Semenya that I think modelled how you moved forward into World Rugby.
Yeah, I mean, and CAS does the same model for many. This is the Court of Arbitration for Sport, sorry. They do this thing where obviously it's an adversarial situation, arbitration. So you're sitting in a room, the three panelists are at the top, and then the opposing sides sit on the left arm and the right arm of what's basically a U. And I sat in for the 4 days of the Castra Semenya trial and found it personally fascinating, because every single topic of discussion is set up like a tennis match, where you have opposing sides and, you know, dissenting voices on opposite sides of the net, and they debate one another, and then a panel has to assess the quality of their arguments. So when the opportunity came to do something for World Rugby, my argument to them was, let's run the same process. And we knew that the issue divided into medical, scientific, legal, ethical, and social lines. And so we said, all right, let's find one person on each issue on opposite sides. So let's find a lawyer who will argue for inclusion and against. Let's get a scientist who argue against, which was Emma and Tommy in this instance, and someone who argue for, which was the aforementioned Jana Harper. We had doctors on opposing sides, and then we had ethicists and social advocacy groups. And we ran it like a court case. We had a working group that was chaired by a former international rugby player from Canada, Araba Chinto, who's now a psychiatrist in Canada. She was the chair lady of the working group. It had medical, legal, player, management voices on it, and we just let them go to it. And you know, it was striking, because when you juxtapose the scientific argument one after the next and you let them debate it, then the difference in the quality of the arguments becomes so apparent. I remember the first morning we had the scientific session and Tommy and Emma presented, and then Jana Harper, and it's just so apparent that there's science on one side and emotion on the other. Even the scientific arguments in favor of trans women inclusion are emotional. And so I think the panel was pretty swayed by the relative quality, the disparity in quality between the arguments. And then we went away, and we saw the legal case, because like the AIC, we knew that there was a legal threat. The difference was that we recognized that this is a colliding rights issue. And so if there's a legal threat coming at you from the left, there's another threat coming at you from the right in the other direction. And so that was a key realization. The legal person on our working group said, we're going to get sued no matter what we do. So let's do the right thing and be sued for doing the right thing instead of car-tying to some lobby group. And anyway, we heard the arguments over a couple of days. We then went away, we consulted more, and we wrote the policy.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you both the same question, and I'll stick with Ross at the moment, which is, you know, what were the things that you heard that maybe surprised you most? I mean, either in the direction of, my God, I can't believe somebody's actually saying that, or, oh, that's an angle that I really hadn't thought of. Like just something that struck you when you were listening in that 4 days, and Emma, for yourself, then when you started to do your research.
Well, see, I was in the luxury position that I'd heard most of the arguments already.
But when you heard them first, so something that has astonished you or surprised you or given you a new viewpoint during this.
I'm going to offload this one to Emma while I think. Help me out, Emma. What struck you?
Probably just to go on from what you said, Ross, was thinking about how I had constructed an argument, and I don't mean to say that, you know, I'd made up anything, about how I understood building an argument. And Tommy talking about, you know, what he was seeing at the kind of the end at which you're measuring kind of performance, and seeing lots of what I would say is quite desperate kind of, okay, well, we know that, but what we're going to do is now start kind of volleying back, almost firefighting on the other side of the table that you've described. So, you know, well, you know, not all women are, you know, this, not all men are this, and these range arguments, and sport is about different types of advantage, of which male advantage is, you know, no more interesting than Michael Phelps's long arms, and I remember thinking, perhaps just to reiterate, they don't have much. They, you know, there is this kind of meaningful competition, nobody defines what that means. And I remember being really struck, because I'd come into this knowing that Joanna Harper had been so key in that 2015 process, and not really realizing how, you know, I'd looked at the paper and it's terrible, but not really realizing really quite how unconvincing as well in person, you know, that this side of the argument was. That, you know, you can have someone who's not very good at writing stuff, but it was really, there wasn't very much. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, you know, but
there isn't more here. There isn't anything here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've spent so long kind of trying to firefight all those kind of spurious responses.
Right.
That's what Emma describes there, is exactly what a few of the panelists on that working group, because as I mentioned, we had a panel. It was myself, our chief medical officer, chief legal, the head of women's rugby, Ruth Chinta, who was the chair lady, and then a players representative. And I think most of them went into it also with unaware of the relative quality. And I remember at the very first tea break, people saying, I thought it would be a little stronger than that, the arguments for inclusion.
Right. Because you probably set it up so that it felt like 50-50, or, you know, it was so formally symmetric.
It was meant to be, yeah. I mean, everyone had the same opportunity. And, you know, when Emma and Tommy finished presenting, then we wanted the lawyers and the scientists on the other side to challenge them, make us see as independent observers. You know, it was like we were the Supreme Court. Convince us, persuade us of why Emma and Tommy were wrong, and there was nothing coming.
So when you say
there were emotional arguments, I mean,
I wanted to pick up on that word emotional. You use that, like, what sort of emotional arguments?
Well, the one argument was, and Joanna Harper made it, said that first she tried to persuade people that there was no advantage, and then she said, but a lot of the time trans women don't get picked because there's a stigma against them because they have an advantage. So hang on, is there or is it not an advantage? And the other argument was, you know, people get hurt all the time because we're obviously a contact sport. So I think it was quite clear that player safety was going to be an important factor. And very early on, the argument was made, rugby injuries happen all the time. You would never be able to attribute injuries to women as a result of playing against trans women because there'd be 1 of 50 injuries in a season or something like that. And so that kind of appeal towards inclusion, the social good that sport does, and therefore trans women should be accommodated in women's sport, became part of the scientific argument. That was the sort of stuff that we expected we would hear on the second day when we were talking about the advocacy arguments, and we had gendered intelligence there, and we had fair play for women. And that's the kind of discussion we were looking at there. Testimonials from trans athletes, and you've seen these, all of you listening to this know what I'm talking about. Turns out that stuff was being made in the morning of the science session.
I mean, I think you're both of you going to spend the entire rest of your life answering the same painful questions, unless you change your name and move to Peru and get facial surgery so no one recognizes you ever again. But like, what is the thing that you would like to say that you could just say it once and for all and then never have to say it again? I'll start with you, Emma. Like, just get everyone to understand one thing and not have to say it to you again.
I don't know. Did you tee me up for that question before we
I think I did. I may have put it slightly differently. Like, yeah, if there was one thing that you could just get everyone to understand, you know?
That, okay. If there are no protected female categories, women won't win sports. And understanding what male advantage is, it's not that, you know, males are always faster or always stronger. It's understanding that they have an advantage that women can't access, and that's male puberty. And if you know, Tommy and I published this review, you can mitigate strength, for example, by 5%. If you take a lower baseline that's 5% lower, maybe you're 10% down, you've still got an advantage over females. And that is a categorical difference between males and females.
And if you could just say that once and make everyone in the world understand it, you would be happy.
Yeah, maybe. I think that's quite long for a slogan. But
what about you, Ross? If there was one thing you could get people to never have to ask you about again?
I want people to understand that they can't address this issue and only think about trans women. And you see this all the time, and I think it's the mistake that the IOC made in the beginning, is they considered, how do we accommodate trans women, or not? I mean, they could have asked it that way. And no one seems to have realized that it's a colliding rights issue. And so by definition, there are two parties here. And sport's not always zero-sum, but a lot of the time it is a zero-sum game. One selection means the omission of another person. There's only one spot on the top step of the podium and 3 on the total. So if people would understand that it's a colliding rights issue, and you should never come into this and only think about it from the perspective of one group, then you would start to appreciate all the other arguments. I mean, I'm just looking at the chat, and I see today RAF has come out with something saying, in the context of Emily Bridges, let me find this, it's the headline saying, trans rights are human rights, which is a vacuous slogan, but so are women's rights, no?
Yeah.
So why do we forget about that? I mean, anyway.
Well,
trans women are entitled to participation in sports in the category of their choice. Well, yes, but so are women. So.
Yeah. So why do you think that? Was it because there weren't any women at the table? Is it that simple?
I think that probably made it simple for them, but I think in general on these issues, there's always an asymmetry, because the only group that's raising an issue is the one who wants some change, right? So the group that's actively trying to move is the one driving the conversation. And you know, it's like if your property is being invaded, you're passive until you see that person in your property, then you respond. And I think at that stage there was an active player, the trans community, and then there was a passive player, and the gatekeeper was facing out. So I'm running with this metaphor, facing out, and they said, "Come on in," and they didn't bother to ask the people whose property they were inviting people into.
I mean, to me, it seems partly as if the idea was so insane in the first place that you don't think you have to defend against it. Like, if arguments are really, really, really weak, you don't prepare for them. You're not expecting to have somebody tell you that it's okay to allow males into female categories, and then they've been let in, and now you're on the back foot. Yeah,
but you know, the secret, the key was that they were given the get out of jail card by the lowering of testosterone, and they built the entire thing on that foundation.
Yeah,
really,
so
that was it. I mean, because I don't think even they would not say like anyone can just self-identify without change. And so they placed a bet that lowering testosterone would fix the issue and effectively allow them never to have to deal with that issue. And so maybe the one question people should be asking is, does the lowering of testosterone work? Yes or no? Simple question. If it does, happy days, they were right. If it doesn't, okay, back to the drawing board.
Well, let's talk about the current situation, because there are two things that we can move on from that. One is that in some countries, they aren't even considering whether it's testosterone or not. They're moving towards pure self-ID. And the other one is that there's research underway on the question of lowering testosterone. So let's talk about the research first. I think, Emma, I'll turn to you. It's at Loughborough you mentioned, maybe some other places too?
Yeah, so Joanna Harper, who has been strangely instrumental in this entire history for like 20 years, she is doing a PhD at Loughborough. They are trying to investigate athletes. So we've got a data gap, right? We don't have a huge, well, you know, 5 years ago, we didn't have a huge number of athletes that we could really study. And we certainly don't have anything approaching what would be a scientific cohort, you know, a group in the same sport, you know, performance before, performance after. That's unlikely to happen. But what Joanna Harper is trying to do is, I think, because I can't access the actual project, it's funded by the IOC, but I've never been able to find the details of the project, but is bringing in athletes, you know, testing them before they suppress testosterone, and then testing them. I think there are some sprinters, there's maybe a rower somewhere, and trying to get some data. Now, these are case-by-case studies. You know, this is an individual, and what the problem that I have, and I think a lot of us have scientifically about this, is that when you bring an athlete into a lab study, let's take Emily Bridges, who is the British cyclist who was prevented from cycling in the female category because UCI said that Emily didn't meet the criteria. Emily Bridges is a trans woman who is in Joanna Harper's study, right? And so we know that cycling is 10, 12% difference, track cycling. Emily Bridges knows how, you know, what that data gap is, right? Emily Bridges knows, what do I need to do to qualify for female racing? And so this is a real issue. You've got an incentive amongst the people that are being brought into the study to underperform. Now, we don't even need to consider whether they are going to underperform. But at the front line, that's a poorly designed study. And what we have on the opposite side actually is now a lot of real life case studies. We have, for example, Leah Thomas, who wasn't in a lab study, whose data we can, you know, look at and try and see in real time when people are being really competitive. And I think that's the massive gap. And I don't really see how you overcome that. I can think in my head of the perfect cohort. I'm sure Ross has thought the same. But it doesn't, I think, involve people who are incentivized to deliver a specific result. And I can't see how that can be a good scientific study.
Want to come in on that, Ross, or shall we move to the question of just pure self-ID?
No, I will. I mean, and it's a major issue going forward. Remember that what the research in the lab would do is allow you to make certain predictions about what will happen in the field. And if the research shows, let's say, that Emily Bridges and others lose the entire male advantage, whether that's 10% or 25%, depends on the sport, then your prediction would be that they'd slot in at the same ranking in women that they came from men, right? But clearly that doesn't happen. Leah Thomas went in at a much higher ranking. Laurel Hubbard, at the age of 40-something in a sport dominated by 20-somethings, became an Olympic athlete. We've seen, in fact, one of the things that has surprised me in the last 2 years is the number of athletes who are dominating in women's sport. You know, 3-4 years ago, there wasn't one. Now I can name 10, and I'm probably only touching half or a third of them. So the pace at which this is happening has been quite surprising. But when World Rugby put its guideline out, one of the requirements from the member unions was that we had to commit to funding research on this issue. So we invited proposals. We have an annual call for funding, and we spend, I don't know, I think last year it was about £500,000 on funding university research. And we got 4 proposals on the trans issue. I don't review them because I see it as a conflict of interest. There are other independent scientists who look at them. Not one of those scientific studies passed muster. They were all deemed to be of very low quality by these independent scientists. And it's because they don't even think about how to control for this incentivization issue. It's not that they try and fail. They don't even think about it. Not one of those 4 proposals actually said, in order to ensure maximum effort by these trans athletes, we're going to do the following measurements and tests and so on. They just say, we assume that this is going to be maximal. It's poor quality research.
Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to a sort of a little 2-minute break in which I'm going to tell you a little bit about sex matters. And then when I come back to talk to Emma and Ross for the last 20 minutes of this webinar, I can see that some of the questions that I've been given are about things like just pure self-ID, why we can't just use data for men compared with women, that sort of thing. have moved on in the 5 years since we had, since we had this discussion, or it's actually 7 years now, isn't it, about testosterone suppression. And now a lot of people are just saying, no, just let them in. Don't even need to suppress testosterone. And I can't see Ross, so I'm going to start with you.
Yes, so the recent guidelines from the IOC, so we've had 2003, 2015, and now 2021, I think maybe just knocking over into 2022, have become increasingly lax. So even despite, big reviews, understanding what happens to muscle and not much happens to bone and that kind of thing, in 2021, what they said was, oh, it's not really testosterone and there can be no presumption of advantage. And basically that's self-ID, right? A male can self-ID to female sport, and until you can show that male, I mean, we don't really know what no presumption of advantage is, but let's assume it's that they're not winning, that then you have to allow them in. And this becomes a complete shift of the burden of proof, right? We spent a long time, nobody had to prove it scientifically. We know that males have advantage in female sport. And so if you want to allow a subset of males in, you should have to show that it's fair for them to be in that sport. And the IOC have just said, no, don't worry. I mean, it's just a complete kind of movement from 2003 where they said, we don't want to deal with this, and what Ross has said all the way through. So the door is open for self-ID because the IOC have said, let males into female sports until you can show that, there's a disadvantage to females. I think that's quite an easy argument to make, but it's remarkable that the IOC have shifted, not just kind of rubbing along with the science, if not really tackling it, but have completely jumped tracks, right? The points have shifted, and they are now no longer using science or sports kind of philosophy or anything. So it's interesting.
It's very odd.
Interesting time.
Ross, do you know anything behind the scenes about that, how that happened? I mean, you said that the testosterone suppression was this absolutely crucial sort of crutch for them in making this move. And now that crutch has been taken away. How did that happen?
Well, remember when Tokyo, I think it was either during or just before Tokyo last year, the chief medical officer of the IOC, a guy called Richard Budgett, was quoted as saying it's become quite clear that the policy is no longer fit for purpose. I think everyone who was on the outside said, well, this is interesting and promising for the sake of women's sport. Maybe the IOC is going to make some changes. And they did, but they went the other way. It was astonishing. I couldn't believe it. Back in 2019, it was 2020, when we released our guidelines, the board and the powers that be at Rugby were very concerned that we were breaking ranks with the IOC, because we were the first Olympic federation to move away from testosterone gains you entry. And so we consulted quite extensively with them, and we explained to them our process and the conclusions we were about to draw. And then once it was out, we had 2 calls with them where they told us what they were doing, not in great detail, but everything I knew suggested that they might go the same way as the other document, which was by the UK Sport Council, went, where they also argued for open and female as the protected category. So I was really blindsided when that happened. Couldn't believe it. And I think one of the things to recognize there is, we've spoken about Joanna Harper's influence on the initial process, at least from science. But one of the other people who's been incredibly influential is Kristen Worley. Just so that people, because I see again in the chat saying, are they afraid of being sued? They were sued by Worley back in about 2013 or 14.
Tell us who Worley is. Sorry, you're about
Kristen
to.
Worley is another trans woman cyclist, Canadian, who didn't just go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport to challenge the testosterone guidelines. They went to a human rights court. And the argument that Worley made was that it was unethical and a violation of human rights for sport to compel people to lower their testosterone. And she made the case that when she lowered her testosterone levels, felt unhealthy and weak and tired, and basically was making the case for competing in women's sport without lowering testosterone, which is effectively just declaration. I'm a woman, now I'll be competing against all of you women. And won that case in a human rights court. So it didn't have an effect on sports policy, but I think it had a profound effect on fear within sport. And I think Worley remained somehow influential in the IOC process. And that IOC policy was basically written by and you'd know more about who they are than I do, Emma, but it was written by a group based out of Canada, which has got very, very strong ties to Worley. And yeah, it's capture of the IOC, I think. Right.
When I have talked to Joanna Harper for a TV debate, which then didn't air, surprise, surprise, let's see if it does. And Joanna Harper's argument, at least now, I don't think it's where Harper started, is that trans women are an unusual subset of male people. Now, that's not Harper's wording, because Harper doesn't use the word male and got cross with me for using it. But my naive starting point would be that we don't need to do studies on trans women in particular. Yes, we would for the sort of research that Ross is talking about, where you're looking to see, is there an advantage that's lost? I'm talking now about self-ID. We just look at the male advantage and the female advantage. We don't have to look at the sort of the subset of people who call themselves women. But Harper feels that they are an unusual subset, that they're different from other male people. Is this something that is a serious consideration, that we need to look at this specific people, or can we just use male people and female people as our two sets, and then there's no sandbagging worries?
So the argument that Harper, or rather the data that Harper is picking up there, is that if you look at baseline characteristics, and Tommy and I, were noticing that in the studies that we looked at for our review. If you look at baseline characteristics of things like weight and strength, muscle mass, trans women tend to be a little bit lower than average for males, right? Something like 5% lower. So they're weaker than the average male. And the argument that's always been thrown back to me and Tommy is that when we say, and they lose 5%, that we've said that's 5%, but people are saying in the broader picture, that's actually 10%. Now, let's be clear, 10% is still not enough to bridge the gap between males and females. But the counter to that, and I think Tommy and I were perhaps a little bit naive when we wrote that, the review and the discussion about baseline differences, because we were looking at where do they end up? Where do trans women end up? And what's the gap to females? So we kind of skirted over a little bit. It wasn't deliberate. It was just something that wasn't really the question we were trying to address. But what we didn't really realise, that people would think that trans women are closer to female, if you take male and female kind of thresholds. We didn't really think people would think trans women were closer to female to start with, because why would they be? Okay, these are males who have been through male development, mini puberty after birth, male puberty for the most part, certainly in the cohorts we were dealing with. And the difference between trans women, males with, a trans identity, is behavioural. They don't go to the gym. They don't want to bulk up. They don't want to get muscles. They don't want to, get big shoulders. And so that's the difference. That's the minus 5% to start with. And sports category shouldn't take that into account. And Tommy and I's argument was, we don't think trans women athletes would be at that baseline. Why, you take your kind of Veronica Ivies or your Kristen Worleys, or there's no reason to think they're 5% weaker, unless you're suggesting that a gender identity makes your muscles smaller, which is an absolutely ridiculous idea. So that's the argument, that trans women as a subset of males are somehow physically different in a way that's innate and is part of their gender identity. And there's just absolutely no scientific rationale for that. It's behavioural, and sports doesn't categorise lazy males, right? If you don't go to the gym, you're not going to win at sport.
Where is this going to go? I'm going to ask both of you. What are the next arguments that are going to arise? What is the next possibly bizarre, possibly left field, or possibly just straightforward declaration going to be? Ross?
I think one of two things happens now. Either the momentum from the last 12 months continues, and we see, because 12 months ago, there was no Leah Thomas, there was no Emily Bridges to talk about. And ironically, just as an aside, remember there was a time when we were told, where are all these athletes? If there was an advantage, where are all the athletes? now we have athletes, the same people are saying, stop picking on individuals. Well, which way do you want it? I mean, the individuals are manifestations of the physiology. So of course it's going to happen more. But you're either going to get more athletes at the level of Leah Thomas, at the level of Emily Bridges, who are very good males and therefore very, very exceptionally good females, but not yet Katie Ledecky. So that in that space between Katie Ledecky and Leah Thomas is wiggle room for those who are a little bit slippery in this debate, right? If it happened in tennis, where there's maybe more parity between the men's and the women's game with respect to media coverage, profile, money, prize money, I think it would be a significant, I hesitate to say advance, because of course everyone listening to this, you're like, it's a step back, but it's actually not. Leah Thomas was probably a good thing for the debate, because finally we had evidence. So either we're going to get the same, or we're going to get a breakthrough athlete where, you know, Leah Thomas was what, 300th in the country. But someday we're going to get someone who is 40th in the country who makes the transition and ends up 3 body lengths ahead of Katie Ledecky. Then it'll be so obvious no one will be able to ignore it anymore. So one of two things will happen, I think.
That's a brave prediction, Ross, and I'm going to hold it to you. No one will be able to defend it anymore. I think we'll see some people defending this to the death.
Yeah, they will. You know, but you know what it is. And sorry, before
okay,
Emma is there was a time, even when I came into this debate, which was a little bit later than Emma, where the argument was very much, is there not an advantage? And you still see that. There are remnants of that argument on the internet. I saw some people making that case today. But there's definitely been a shift where it's become, I think, much more difficult for people to hold the position that there is no advantage and argue for inclusion on the basis of fairness. Now it's quite obvious you're arguing for inclusion despite unfairness.
Right.
And at least now the cards are on the table. Now you can actually say, all right, fine, you want trans women included. You know it's not fair, yet you're still making that case. So now we can see your motives a little bit more clearly than we might have done in the past, where we could tap dance around the, you know, they're not, the research not on athletes. We haven't had cases yet. Trans women are not biologically male. That's the argument you've just been talking about. And over time, all that stuff will be swept aside and it'll be very clear. The spotlight will be on it. And we'll be left saying, you want trans women in women's sport? Fine, but you realize that that's not fair. And so you're taking an anti-woman position when you do that.
Emma, what do you think? Where are we going?
I think I saw something from Joanna Harper reported this week that even moves along from that. So we've seen as Ross just described, well, it might be fair. You don't really know any different. Let's just see how it goes. Then we've now shifted to data where even the biggest advocates can't say it's fair, but what they've said is it's not so unfair. You know, it's unfair, but, you know, it's marginal. And I saw from Joanna Harper this week saying, well, even if it's really unfair, we're trading this off against the psychological and social disadvantages that trans people have. And so I think we've shifted even from fairness, meaningful competition to now, even if it's not meaningful, that there should be sacrifice. And I think that's laying bare, it's stripping back, like you say, Ross, you're slowly kind of, you know, stripping the willow and finding out what the core is. And the core now is, I think, probably what we were seeing, you know, 5, 8, 10 years ago, which is actually, it doesn't matter if it's unfair and they don't care if it's meaningful. What they're arguing is you must include, and people, you know, girls, women who are losing out must accept that for the greater good. And that SCED report, the Sports Council UK report, shows that women in sports value fairness. They, you know, people want inclusion. We can work around like how to keep people in sports, get people into sports and have them play sports. But fairness is about, you know, fairness is the thing that gives sports meaning. And now I think they're at a situation where they're saying it's unfair, it's not even tolerable, but it's a kind of trade-off for a social injustice.
So sacrifice, basically. It's crazy.
So Ross, I have one last question, and it's you'll realise why it's for you and not for Emma. And this is not from me. This is one of the questions that came in, which is, how does it feel to be a feminist icon?
I don't know about that. I saw that question. I'm honored and I'm very happy to be. But I'll tell you one thing I've learned is I'm glad I'm a feminist icon as a man. Because the one thing that struck me in this debate is how much more abuse women get for defending their space than I get for defending it and making these arguments. Emma and I can post the same tweets in response to some academics and someone on Twitter, and I'll get silence or blocked and Emma will get abuse. And I think that's quite telling, actually. I think the motives of people have been revealed over the course of this debate in that way.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone who came along for our first ever Sex Matters webinar. And we will have many, many more Sex Matters webinars, and they will be fancier every time, but the content will never be better. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Helen and Sex Matters, for inviting me. It was an honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Emma. See you soon.